The story begins with Maya Thompson, a confident and accomplished marketing executive, stepping onto a luxurious international flight from New York to London. She had worked hard for this moment. Years of dedication and late nights had earned her not just a seat in first class, but also an invitation to speak at a prestigious global conference. Dressed in a sleek navy blue suit paired with pearl earrings, Maya exuded professionalism as she walked down the aisle, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. The cabin buzzed softly with the sounds of passengers settling in, their voices blending into a low hum. Maya found her assigned seat near the window, placing her bag carefully in the overhead compartment before sitting down. As she adjusted her scarf and glanced out at the tarmac, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. First class was different this time. It wasn't just about comfort. It symbolized how far she'd come. But that feeling didn't last long. A man named Richard, seated beside her, immediately caught her attention. He was tall, middle-aged, and dressed in an expensive-looking blazer. From the moment he arrived, his demeanor seemed off-putting. His eyes darted toward Maya briefly before he sighed audibly, muttering something under his breath about people taking up too much space. At first, Maya brushed it off, assuming it was just typical pre-flight stress. She opened her laptop, ready to review her presentation slides for the upcoming conference. However, Richard's behavior grew increasingly hostile. Every time Maya shifted slightly in her seat or reached for her phone, he let out exaggerated sighs or made subtle comments loud enough for her to hear. "Some people don't know what they're doing here," he said once, glancing pointedly at her. Though his words weren't explicitly racist yet, the undertone was clear. Other passengers nearby began to notice the tension. A young couple across the aisle exchanged uncomfortable looks, while an older woman 2 rows ahead turned her head slightly, trying to gauge the situation without being obvious. Some gave Maya sympathetic smiles, while others avoided eye contact altogether, perhaps unsure of how to react. Despite the growing unease around her, Maya remained calm. She reminded herself that reacting impulsively wouldn't solve anything. Instead, she focused on her work, determined not to let Richard ruin her trip. But Richard wasn't done. When the flight attendants came by offering drinks, he flagged one down and asked if there was any way to move seats. "I can't concentrate with all this commotion," he said, gesturing vaguely in Maya's direction. The attendant hesitated, clearly caught off guard, before politely explaining that no other seats were available in first class. Richard frowned deeply, shooting Maya another disapproving look. It was becoming impossible to ignore the hostility radiating from him. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Maya felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had faced prejudice before, microaggressions at work, suspicious glances in stores. But this felt different. Being singled out in such a public setting, surrounded by strangers who either supported her silently or stayed indifferent, left her feeling exposed. Yet, even amidst the discomfort, a spark of determination ignited within her. If Richard thought he could intimidate her, he was wrong. Little did he know, this encounter would set off a chain of events neither of them could have anticipated. As the plane soared higher into the sky, the atmosphere in first class grew increasingly tense. Richard, still visibly irritated by Maya's presence, continued his passive-aggressive behavior. He shifted noisily in his seat, rearranged his belongings multiple times, and even leaned over to whisper complaints to another passenger seated across the aisle. His tone was laced with thinly veiled disdain, though he never directly addressed Maya again, at least not politely. The flight attendants, noticing the growing tension, tried to intervene subtly by offering extra snacks or drinks, but their efforts only seemed to make things worse. At one point, Richard decided to escalate matters further. When Maya adjusted her armrest slightly, a normal action that any traveler might take, he loudly proclaimed, "Excuse me, do you mind? You're invading my space." His voice carried through the quiet cabin, drawing stares from nearby passengers. Some looked away awkwardly, while others watched intently, waiting to see how Maya would respond. For her part, Maya remained composed, turning toward him with a calm expression. "I'm sorry," she replied evenly, "but I haven't moved beyond my seat. Perhaps we can both try to relax." Richard scoffed at her response, shaking his head as if she were deliberately misunderstanding him. "Relax. That's easy for you to say," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those around them to hear. Then came the comment that crossed the line. "Maybe economy is more your speed." The words hung heavy in the air, sharp and unmistakable. A few gasps rippled through the cabin, followed by an uncomfortable silence. Even the flight attendants froze momentarily, unsure of what to do next. Maya felt her cheeks flush, but she refused to let Richard see her falter. She flagged down a flight attendant and explained the situation quietly, hoping for some resolution. To her dismay, the response was disappointing. The attendant nodded sympathetically but offered little more than a generic apology. "We'll speak to him," they promised vaguely, before walking away without addressing Richard directly. Maya watched them go, frustration bubbling beneath her surface. It wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about the airline's failure to protect her as a paying customer. The lack of action emboldened Richard, who smirked smugly when he noticed no consequences for his behavior. Other passengers began reacting too, though not all in supportive ways. One man sitting behind Maya leaned forward and whispered, "Just ignore him. It's not worth it." While well-intentioned, his advice felt dismissive, as if her dignity could simply be brushed aside. On the other hand, a woman seated diagonally from her gave Maya a reassuring nod, mouthing the words, "Stay strong." These small gestures reminded Maya that not everyone agreed with Richard's behavior, even if they weren't vocal about it. Despite the mounting pressure, Maya found herself reflecting on the absurdity of the situation. Here she was, a successful professional traveling for work, being treated like an intruder in a space she had every right to occupy. Was it really about the armrest, or was it something deeper? She thought about all the times she'd been underestimated because of her race or gender, the job interviews where she had to prove herself twice as hard, the networking events where people assumed she didn't belong. This moment felt like yet another test of her resilience. By the time the meal service began, the tension had reached a boiling point. Richard complained loudly about the food, seemingly determined to disrupt the peace further. Meanwhile, Maya kept her focus on her own tasks, jotting notes for her upcoming presentation, and occasionally glancing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below. Each passing minute felt heavier than the last, but she knew she couldn't let this incident define her journey. Something inside her stirred, a quiet resolve to ensure that moments like these wouldn't go unnoticed or unchallenged ever again. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the tension in first class became almost unbearable. Richard, still visibly annoyed by Maya's presence, continued his relentless campaign of subtle hostility. He shifted in his seat with exaggerated movements, making sure everyone around could hear him sighing loudly each time Maya adjusted her posture or reached for something. At one point, he even leaned over to a passenger seated across the aisle and whispered audibly, "Some people just don't know their place." His words dripped with disdain, though he never directly confronted Maya. At least not yet. The other passengers began to notice. A young couple sitting nearby exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. An older woman 2 rows ahead turned slightly in her seat, pretending to adjust her blanket while stealing furtive looks at the unfolding drama. Some offered Maya sympathetic smiles, while others avoided eye contact altogether, perhaps afraid of being drawn into the conflict. Despite the growing unease, Maya remained calm, focusing on reviewing her presentation slides as if nothing unusual was happening. She reminded herself that reacting impulsively would only escalate the situation. But Richard wasn't done. When Maya moved her armrest ever so slightly, a completely normal action that any traveler might do, he seized the opportunity to make a scene. "Excuse me," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the cabin. Do you mind? You're invading my space." Passengers craned their necks to see what was going on, some whispering among themselves. Maya turned to face him, maintaining her composure. "I'm sorry," she replied evenly, "but I haven't moved beyond my seat. Perhaps we can both try to relax." Richard scoffed, shaking his head as though she were deliberately misunderstanding him. Then came the comment that crossed the line. "Maybe economy is more your speed." The words reverberated through the cabin, sharp and unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the air, followed by an awkward silence. Even the flight attendants froze momentarily, unsure how to respond. Maya felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck, but she refused to let Richard see her falter. Instead, she flagged down a flight attendant and explained the situation quietly, hoping for some resolution. To her dismay, the response was underwhelming. The attendant nodded sympathetically, but offered little more than a generic apology. "We'll speak to him," they promised vaguely, before walking away without addressing Richard directly. Maya watched them go, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. It wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about the airline's failure to protect her as a paying customer. Their inaction emboldened Richard, who smirked smugly when he realized there would be no consequences for his behavior. Other passengers began reacting too, though not all in supportive ways. One man sitting behind Maya leaned forward and whispered, "Just ignore him. It's not worth it." While well-intentioned, his advice felt dismissive, as if her dignity could simply be brushed aside. On the other hand, a woman seated diagonally from her gave Maya a reassuring nod, mouthing the words, "Stay strong." These small gestures reminded Maya that not everyone agreed with Richard's behavior, even if they weren't vocal about it. Despite the mounting pressure, Maya found herself reflecting on the absurdity of the situation. Here she was, a successful professional traveling for work, being treated like an intruder in a space she had every right to occupy. Was it really about the armrest, or was it something deeper? She thought about all the times she'd been underestimated because of her race or gender, the job interviews where she had to prove herself twice as hard, the networking events where people assumed she didn't belong. This moment felt like yet another test of her resilience. By the time the meal service began, the tension had reached a boiling point. Richard complained loudly about everything: the temperature of his drink, the portion size of his meal, the way the tray table wobbled. It was as if he wanted to dominate the atmosphere, ensuring no one could forget his presence. Meanwhile, Maya kept her focus on her own tasks, jotting notes for her upcoming presentation and occasionally glancing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below. Each passing minute felt heavier than the last, but she knew she couldn't let this incident define her journey. Something inside her stirred, a quiet resolve to ensure that moments like these wouldn't go unnoticed or unchallenged ever again. By the time the plane began its descent into London, Maya had reached her breaking point. The hours spent enduring Richard's relentless hostility and the airline staff's failure to intervene left her feeling drained, but also deeply determined. As the seatbelt sign lit up and passengers prepared for landing, Maya made a decision that would change everything. Quietly, she pulled out her phone and opened the camera app. With steady hands, she discreetly recorded Richard's behavior, the snide comments, the exaggerated sighs, and the smug expressions he wore after each jab. She captured not only his words but also the reactions of those around them, the uncomfortable glances, the whispered conversations, and the flight attendants' hesitant body language as they avoided addressing the issue. Once the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Maya quickly saved the recording and drafted a powerful statement to accompany it. "This is what racism looks like in 2023, she wrote. "It isn't always blatant. Sometimes it hides behind polite remarks or passive-aggressive actions. But make no mistake, it cuts just as deep." She went on to describe how the airline's lack of action had compounded the harm, turning what should have been a routine flight into an ordeal she'd never forget. Before posting, she hesitated for a moment, knowing that sharing her experience publicly could invite scrutiny and backlash. But then she remembered the countless others who might be silently suffering similar indignities, too afraid or unsure to speak up. With a deep breath, she hit post. Within minutes, the video began gaining traction. Social media users were quick to rally behind Maya, flooding the comments section with messages of support. "You handled this with such grace," one person wrote. "Thank you for speaking out," another added. Others shared their own stories of discrimination on flights, creating a thread of solidarity that stretched across continents. Influencers and activists joined in, amplifying Maya's voice and calling for accountability from the airline. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #AirlineAccountability started trending globally, drawing attention not only to her specific case, but also to broader issues of racial bias in air travel. As the story spread, major news outlets picked it up, eager to cover the viral incident. Reporters reached out to Maya for interviews, and within days, her face was everywhere, on morning talk shows, evening news segments, and online articles. Each time she spoke, Maya used the platform to highlight systemic inequities, emphasizing that her experience wasn't isolated, but part of a larger pattern. "This isn't about me versus one man," she explained during one interview. "It's about how institutions fail people of color every day by ignoring these kinds of behaviors, or worse, enabling them." The public outcry grew louder as more details emerged. Passengers who had been on the same flight came forward, corroborating Maya's account and describing how uncomfortable they'd felt witnessing the incident. One woman recounted how she'd wanted to say something but feared retaliation. A businessman admitted he'd initially dismissed the situation as trivial until watching the video later, which made him realize the gravity of what had happened. Their testimonies painted a vivid picture of the toxic environment created by both Richard's actions and the airline's indifference. Meanwhile, the airline remained eerily silent. For nearly 48 hours, there was no official response, not even a generic apology. This silence only fueled the fire, with critics accusing the company of complicity and negligence. Protesters gathered outside the airline's headquarters, holding signs that read "Your racism costs too much" and "First-class treatment for all." Flyers circulated online urging travelers to boycott the airline, and hashtags calling for investigations gained momentum. What had started as a single passenger's act of defiance had snowballed into a global movement demanding justice and reform. Through it all, Maya stayed grounded, leaning on her family, friends, and supporters for strength. Though the sudden spotlight brought challenges, including hateful messages from trolls and skeptics, she refused to let negativity derail her mission. Every comment, every share, and every word of encouragement reminded her why she'd chosen to speak out. By the end of the week, it was clear that this incident was far from over. The world was watching, waiting to see how the airline would respond, and whether real change would follow. The backlash against the airline quickly reached a fever pitch, with public outrage spreading like wildfire. Social media users, activists, and even celebrities joined forces to demand accountability, turning what had started as an isolated incident into a full-blown crisis for the company. Protesters gathered outside the airline's headquarters, holding signs that read "Stop Protecting Racism" and "Equality in the Air." Online petitions calling for investigations into the airline's practices gained hundreds of thousands of signatures within days. Yet despite the mounting pressure, the airline remained eerily silent, offering no meaningful response to address the growing storm. For nearly 2 days, the only statement the airline issued was a vague apology posted on their official Twitter account. "We regret any discomfort experienced during recent flights and are committed to ensuring all passengers feel welcome aboard our aircraft." The message was met with immediate criticism for its lack of specificity and sincerity. Many pointed out that it failed to acknowledge Maya's experience or condemn Richard's behavior outright. Critics argued that the airline was treating the situation as a PR problem rather than a human one, prioritizing damage control over genuine accountability. As the silence dragged on, the consequences began piling up. Major sponsors and corporate partners, once proud affiliates of the airline, started pulling out, citing reputational risks. A prominent credit card company announced it would suspend its co-branded travel rewards program with the airline until further notice. Luxury brands that had previously advertised in-flight amenities also distanced themselves, issuing statements condemning discrimination in all forms. Even frequent flyers, who had long been loyal customers, began canceling memberships and switching to competitors. For many, the airline's refusal to take responsibility felt like a betrayal, proof that profit mattered more to them than people. Inside the airline's offices, executives scrambled to contain the fallout. Emergency meetings were held around the clock, but panic overshadowed strategy. Leaked internal emails revealed divisions among leadership, with some advocating for transparency and others pushing for minimal engagement, hoping the controversy would blow over. Meanwhile, employees at various levels expressed frustration, sharing stories of their own about how the company routinely ignored complaints related to discrimination. One former flight attendant recounted being reprimanded for speaking up after witnessing racist remarks directed at a passenger. Another employee described how diversity training sessions were often treated as optional or dismissed as unnecessary. Amid the chaos, investigative journalists dug deeper, uncovering troubling patterns within the airline's operations. Reports surfaced detailing numerous unresolved complaints from passengers and staff alike, alleging everything from racial profiling during security checks to discriminatory seating policies. Former employees came forward to share their experiences, painting a picture of a corporate culture riddled with bias and neglect. These revelations added fuel to the fire, intensifying calls for systemic reform. Activist groups organized virtual town halls, inviting industry experts and victims of discrimination to discuss potential solutions. The conversation expanded beyond the airline itself, shining a spotlight on broader issues of inequality in air travel. Despite the overwhelming evidence and public demand for action, the airline continued to stall. Its initial attempts to downplay the incident only made matters worse. When a spokesperson finally appeared on a morning news show, their defensive tone and evasive answers infuriated viewers. Why does it always take a scandal for companies to care? One commentator tweeted, "They're not sorry, they're scared." By the end of the week, it was clear that the airline's reputation had taken a massive hit. Stock prices plummeted, and analysts predicted long-term financial losses if the company didn't act swiftly. But for Maya and her supporters, this wasn't just about money. It was about justice. The movement sparked by her courage showed no signs of slowing down, proving that when individuals stand up against injustice, they can ignite change far greater than themselves. And though the airline still hadn't responded adequately, the world was watching and waiting to see what they'd do next. Empowered by the overwhelming support she'd received, Maya decided it was time to take her fight to the next level. With the help of a renowned civil rights attorney, she filed a lawsuit against both Richard and the airline. The legal action sent shockwaves through the industry, drawing even more attention to the case. The lawsuit accused Richard of racial discrimination and harassment, while holding the airline accountable for failing to protect its passengers and address the toxic environment on board. It also highlighted systemic issues within the company, citing leaked documents and testimonies from former employees that revealed a pattern of neglect when it came to addressing discrimination. The media frenzy intensified as news of the lawsuit broke. Reporters camped outside courthouses and interviewed legal experts who weighed in on the potential implications of the case. For the first time, the airline found itself forced to respond publicly, not with vague apologies, but with concrete steps toward accountability. In a hastily arranged press conference, executives announced an internal investigation into the incident and pledged to review their policies regarding passenger safety and employee training. However, many remained skeptical, questioning whether these promises were genuine or simply another attempt to save face. Maya became a household name almost overnight. Invitations poured in from talk shows, podcasts, and conferences eager to hear her story. During each appearance, she spoke candidly about her experiences, not just on the flight, but throughout her life. She shared stories of subtle yet persistent racism, being followed in stores, having her credentials questioned at work, and enduring microaggressions that chipped away at her confidence over the years. Her vulnerability resonated deeply with audiences, inspiring countless others to come forward with their own accounts of discrimination in air travel. A hashtag #MyFlightStory, began trending as people recounted moments they previously kept buried. One particularly powerful moment came during an interview with a popular morning show host. When asked how she managed to stay composed during such a dehumanizing experience, Maya paused before responding. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but I knew that if I let his behavior break me, he would win. And I couldn't let that happen, not just for myself, but for everyone else who's ever been made to feel small because of who they are." Her words struck a chord, sparking conversations about resilience, representation, and the importance of standing up against injustice. Behind the scenes, Maya worked tirelessly alongside advocacy groups to push for broader reforms in the aviation industry. Together, they drafted proposals for stricter anti-discrimination policies, mandatory diversity training for all staff, and independent oversight committees to handle complaints. These efforts gained traction as influential figures in politics and business threw their weight behind the cause. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at holding airlines accountable for discriminatory practices, while corporate leaders called for industry-wide standards to ensure equitable treatment for all passengers. Meanwhile, Richard faced consequences of his own. Though he initially dismissed the backlash as overblown, the mounting pressure took its toll. His employer, a high-profile consulting firm, placed him on leave pending an ethics review after videos of his behavior went viral. Friends and colleagues reportedly distanced themselves from him, uncomfortable with being associated with someone labeled a public bigot, while some sympathized with Richard, arguing that he had been shamed unfairly. The majority agreed that his actions warranted accountability. As weeks turned into months, the case continued to dominate headlines. Legal proceedings moved slowly, but Maya remained steadfast, using every opportunity to amplify her message. She wrote opinion pieces for major newspapers, gave keynote speeches at conferences, and collaborated with filmmakers to create a documentary about her journey. Through it all, she emphasized that this fight wasn't just about her. It was about creating a world where no one had to endure what she did. By taking a stand, Maya had not only challenged a single act of racism, but also ignited a movement that promised lasting change. The fallout from the lawsuit and public outcry proved devastating for the airline. What had started as an isolated incident on a single flight had spiraled into a full-blown crisis, exposing deep-rooted issues within the company's culture and operations. Major sponsors who once proudly aligned themselves with the brand began severing ties, citing irreparable damage to its reputation. Luxury brands that advertised in-flight amenities pulled their campaigns, while corporate partners suspended lucrative co-branded deals. Even frequent flyers, many of whom had accumulated years' worth of loyalty points, canceled memberships en masse, opting instead for competitors perceived as more inclusive and accountable. Internally, the airline was in disarray. Executives scrambled to salvage what remained of their crumbling image, but every attempt seemed too little too late. The vague apologies and generic promises of reform were no longer enough to appease an increasingly vigilant public. Employees at all levels grew disillusioned, with some speaking out anonymously about the toxic work environment they endured daily. Former staffers recounted stories of racial bias during hiring processes, unequal treatment among colleagues, and dismissive attitudes toward passenger complaints. These revelations painted a damning picture of systemic neglect, further eroding trust in the company. In a desperate bid to regain control, the airline announced sweeping changes aimed at addressing the backlash. They unveiled plans to implement mandatory diversity training programs for all employees, from cabin crew to senior management. Additionally, they pledged to establish a passenger advisory board composed of individuals from diverse backgrounds to provide feedback on policies and practices. To demonstrate transparency, the airline also promised regular audits conducted by independent third-party organizations to ensure compliance with anti-discrimination standards. While these measures signaled progress, critics remained cautious, questioning whether the changes would translate into meaningful action or simply serve as window dressing. Financially, the impact was staggering. Stock prices plummeted to record lows, wiping out billions in market value. Analysts predicted long-term losses unless the airline could restore consumer confidence quickly. Travel agencies reported a sharp decline in bookings, with customers actively avoiding the carrier even when it offered discounted fares. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #BoycottThisAirline and #ChooseEquality, urging travelers to support companies committed to fairness and inclusion. Competitors seized the opportunity, launching marketing campaigns highlighting their own efforts to promote diversity and equity. For Richard, the man whose actions sparked the controversy, life became increasingly difficult. His employer placed him on indefinite leave after videos of his behavior went viral, and he faced widespread condemnation both online and offline. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone now branded a bigot. Though Richard attempted to defend himself in interviews, claiming he'd been misunderstood, his explanations fell flat. Public sentiment overwhelmingly sided with Maya, viewing her as a symbol of resilience and justice in the face of blatant prejudice. As the dust began to settle, the airline's leadership underwent a dramatic shakeup. Several top executives resigned under pressure, replaced by new leaders tasked with rebuilding trust and fostering a more inclusive culture. Advertisements featuring diverse casts appeared across platforms, emphasizing themes of unity and respect. Yet, despite these efforts, skepticism lingered. Passengers demanded proof, not just words, that real change was taking place. Through it all, Maya watched closely, aware that the battle wasn't over. While the airline's reforms marked a step forward, she knew true transformation required sustained effort. For now, however, there was hope, a glimmer of possibility that her courage had sparked something bigger than herself, a movement toward accountability, equality, and lasting change. The legal battle between Maya, Richard, and the airline dragged on for months, but its impact extended far beyond courtrooms and settlement negotiations. For Maya, this wasn't just about winning a case, it was about creating meaningful change that would outlast any verdict. As her story continued to resonate globally, she emerged as a powerful advocate for racial justice and equity in the aviation industry. Her courage inspired countless others to share their own experiences of discrimination, sparking a wave of awareness and accountability that rippled through airlines worldwide. With the help of advocacy groups, Maya launched several initiatives aimed at promoting inclusivity in air travel. One of her most notable projects was the creation of a passenger bill of rights, which outlined clear guidelines for how airlines should handle incidents of discrimination or harassment. The document emphasized zero tolerance for racism, mandatory training for staff, and transparent reporting systems for passengers to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Airlines around the world began adopting similar frameworks, recognizing the urgent need to rebuild trust with travelers from marginalized communities. Maya also partnered with educators and activists to develop workshops designed to address unconscious bias among airline employees. These sessions went beyond traditional diversity training, encouraging participants to reflect on their own assumptions and behaviors, while equipping them with practical tools to foster respectful interactions. Feedback from early adopters was overwhelmingly positive, with many attendees describing the workshops as eye-opening and transformative. Slowly but surely, attitudes within the industry began to shift. In addition to her advocacy work, Maya channeled her energy into writing a memoir titled Above the Clouds, Rising Above Racism. The book detailed her journey, from the humiliating encounter on the flight to the global movement it ignited, and offered insights into resilience, self-worth, and the power of standing up against injustice. It quickly became a bestseller, praised for its honesty and relatability. Readers connected deeply with Maya's vulnerability, finding inspiration in her determination to turn pain into purpose. Schools and community organizations incorporated the memoir into discussions about race and equality, further amplifying its message. Despite the progress, Maya remained acutely aware that systemic change takes time. She often reminded herself, and her supporters, that victories, no matter how significant, were only stepping stones toward a larger goal. During interviews and speaking engagements, she emphasized the importance of staying vigilant. "We've made strides," she said during one keynote speech, "but we can't afford to become complacent. Real change requires constant effort, not just from corporations, but from all of us." For the airline involved, the road to redemption was long and challenging. While initial reforms signaled a commitment to improvement, maintaining momentum proved difficult. Internal audits revealed ongoing gaps in employee understanding of anti-discrimination policies, prompting additional rounds of training and stricter enforcement measures. Passengers reported mixed experiences. Some noted marked improvements in how complaints were handled, while others felt there was still room for growth. Nevertheless, the company persisted, knowing that regaining public trust would take years of consistent action. As for Richard, his life never fully recovered from the fallout. Once a respected figure in his field, he struggled to rebuild his career after being ostracized by colleagues and peers. Though he occasionally attempted to justify his actions, claiming he'd been unfairly targeted, few listened. In a twist of irony, his behavior served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked prejudice, a narrative Maya hoped would deter others from making similar mistakes. By the end of it all, Maya found solace not in vengeance, but in the knowledge that her voice had sparked something extraordinary. Through sheer determination and unwavering resolve, she had transformed a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change. And though the fight for equality was far from over, she took pride in knowing she had helped pave the way for a brighter, more inclusive future.